goodness is worthless. That saying, I'm doing my best, I'm doing the best I can, is simply not true. No one in all of history has ever done their best outside of God's power. God's assessment of human beings' goodness is that their best is useless before Him. Their good deeds do not and cannot outweigh their bad deeds. All of man's religious assets are consumed by their guilt of sin. Paul himself had once boasted in his own religious gains, but he came to realize how worthless or useless they were. Now, throughout this indictment that Paul is placing concerning humanity's unrighteousness, their lack of a right relationship with God, their unreasonableness, and their unresponsiveness and their unrepentant hearts, the entire human race is found guilty before God. Every single man, woman, boy, and girl is included in this exposure of the universality of human sin. We are all sinners before God. And that is Paul's whole point up to now, is that no one is declared righteous in and of himself. Verses 13 through 18 reveal the depravity of human sin. All of humanity is guilty before God, but also deeply, deeply guilty before God. Paul proved this true by addressing the things that men say, the things that men do. Verses 13 and 14 draw attention to man's vile words, what we say, what comes out of our mouth. And Paul continues quoting from the Old Testament as he piles up evidence against mankind. First, Paul displays what characterizes men's speech, that being the vileness of the open grave. The first part of verse 13 says their throat is an open grave. Now, this is an excellent imagery here, an excellent way to drive home the point that human speech can be full of corruption. Imagine the awful smell of an open grave. There's a dead body in that grave and it's open, and you can imagine how terrible that smell would be. Now, that terrible smell is not the result of the grave itself, it's the result of the rottenness within that grave. The same is true with our mouths. What can come out of our mouths? Unclean, unkind, untrue words that expose a defiled, spiteful, and deceitful heart. That's what comes out of your mouth. What shows the vileness within is what we allow to come out of our mouths. Now, secondly, Paul displays what characterizes man's speech, that being the venom of the viper. Now, the second part of verse 13 and verse 14 say, they deceive with their tongues. Viper's venom is under their lips. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Now, the fangs of a viper, a poisonous snake, usually lie folded back in their upper jaw. And now when it throws up its head to strike, those terrible hollow fangs will drop down, and as it bites, the fangs press a sac of deadly poison that's in the back at the root, and thus injects this venom into a wound. Human beings are all born with a moral poison sac like the viper. Our strikes at one another are with venomous words. How many times have we tore somebody apart with the words that we've used about them? We've found fault in them, and we've said this and that about them, and we've been critical of their lives. Think about how that tears people apart. That is venom out of our mouths. Now, foul speech is also offensive to God. Matthew 12:36, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. Did you know that that verse was there? That's a scary one when we speak a lot. I talk a lot. And to think that every careless word that comes out of my mouth, I'm going to be held accountable for. That's a scary thought. Every word we utter is open to the inspection and the judgment of our God. Not one word or one volume that we've stored up of words can be withdrawn. Here, Paul has pointed out that man's vile words form an important part of God's indictment of him. Verses 15 through 18 expose man's evil ways, our ways, the things that we do. God's judgment rests not only on what we say, but also on what we do. Now, first of all, Paul points out that murder is a characteristic of human behavior. Verse 15, their feet are swift to shed blood. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Did you realize that the first recorded sin outside of the Garden of Eden was murder? Now, Adam and Eve's first sin, the sin in the garden, where they took of the fruit that they should not have, was the first sin, and it separated man from God. But the second sin, Cain's murder of his brother Abel, separated man from man. Paul states that man is swift or quick to shed blood. Now let's move to a more modern era. Think about World War II, what happened with the Nazis, the SS, and Hitler, and what they did with these concentration camps. And I was looking at some figures the other day. 25 million people died as a result of the concentration camps. That is a terrible number. We know 6 million Jews, but then obviously there were others that died in these camps also. And the terrible experiments that were done upon the people there. That I can't even speak of some of them that I was reading and I've seen, and I know most of you know about that and know what went on there. Just terrible, terrible things done. If I had a lab rat, most of us would not even do that to a rat, the things that were done to mankind, to other people. These crimes were committed and condoned by one of the most enlightened cultures and advanced nations of Europe. You don't get any more advanced than Germany, especially at this time. Their scientists were the greatest in the world, probably still are the greatest. And look at what they did. And man's swift to shed, or quick to shed blood. It's all too easy for us to say that I would never do this, that I would never be a part of such a thing. That's not the point. The point is that the human heart is heir to every imaginable crime. Now Jesus said even look at a woman with lust was to commit adultery with her. And to think a thought of hatred towards someone was to murder someone. Only God's restraining grace prevents our sin from finding its full measure. Now, second of all, Paul points out that misery is a characteristic of man's evil ways. Verses 16 and 17, ruin and wretchedness are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. Now, in regards to all the evil that took place during World War II, the world united there to say, we will never let this happen again. They united together. What was the real result of that? We see the terrible atrocities of China today, the slave labor, the abortions that go on there, other evils that dwarf what Hitler and the Nazis did. Communist China is one vast prison. In China, terror is a recognized policy of state. Man cannot, even when he thinks he's enlightened, find a way of peace. But nearly 2,000 years ago, one came to this earth whose name was the Prince of Peace. And at his birth, angels chanted, glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth, goodwill toward men. But it wasn't too long that the world united at Calvary to crucify him, and mankind will know nothing but wars and rumors of wars until this crucified, until this resurrected Christ returns. And until then, man's misery is not only something to be endured, but it is something for which man is